In the year 541, the Roman Empire appeared to be at the height of its power. From his capital at Constantinople, the Emperor Justinian was reconquering the Mediterranean. North Africa had fallen, Italy was being retaken, and Rome itself was nearly within his grasp. His general Belisarius had become the most famous soldier in the world. Then, from the southern edge of the empire, something arrived that no army could stop. It started in Egypt, in the port city of Pelusium, at the mouth of the Nile. From there it rode the grain ships that fed the empire, moving up the coast through Alexandria into Syria along the trade routes, until in the spring of 542 it reached Constantinople itself. This was the Plague of Justinian, the first recorded pandemic in human history, and it nearly destroyed the wealthiest empire on earth. This is Empires and Economics. To understand what Justinian's plague did to the economy, you first have to understand what it was and just how quickly it moved. The plague was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium, confirmed by ancient DNA recovered from 6th century skeletons, that would later cause the Black Death of the 14th century. But in the 6th century, no one knew what it was or how it spread. There was no quarantine that worked, no understanding of rats and fleas, no modern medicine to blunt its force. Rabbit or rat fleas carried the bacterium from infected animals to humans. In its bubonic form, victims developed swollen, blackened swellings in the groin and armpits. In its pneumonic form, it attacked the lungs and spread directly from person to person through the air. Either way, it struck with terrifying speed. The grain trade is what made the plague unstoppable. Constantinople was a city of perhaps 500,000 people that could not feed itself. It depended entirely on the annual grain fleets from Egypt and North Africa. Every spring, ships loaded with wheat sailed from Alexandria to the capital, carrying not just food for the empire's greatest city, but the rats and fleas that carried the epidemic. The Roman world had built the most sophisticated supply chain in antiquity precisely to feed its capital. That achievement, magnificent in peacetime, became the plague's delivery system in 541. We are extraordinarily lucky to have eyewitness accounts of the Plague of Justinian because the two greatest writers in the empire both lived through it. The historian Procopius, who had accompanied Belisarius on his campaigns, devoted the second book of his history of the wars entirely to the plague. He described victims seized with sudden fever, then the swellings, then delirium, then death, often within days. He reported that the death toll in Constantinople grew so enormous that the authorities ran out of places to bury the dead. Procopius wrote of bodies piling up in the streets, of the emperor ordering pits dug to hold thousands of corpses at once, of towers emptied of the dead who had been stacked inside because no one would bury them. But the most harrowing account comes from a Syrian monk named John of Ephesus, who was in the city himself. He described men and women suddenly struck down in the middle of the day, falling where they stood. He wrote that the dying lay in the streets crying out for water, that the city emptied as those who could fled to the countryside, and that the harvest rotted in the fields because there was no one to bring them in. Even the Emperor Justinian himself fell ill. He survived, but the empire he was rebuilding would never be the same. Now let's talk about what the plague did to the economy of the Byzantine world. And the first effect was the simplest and most devastating. It destroyed the labor force. Across the empire, the death toll was staggering. Modern scholars estimate that in many regions the plague killed between 1/4 and 1/2 of the population. Constantinople's population may have fallen by half in the space of a single year. The empire simply lost a catastrophic share of its farmers, its craftsmen, its taxpayers, and its soldiers all at once. When laborers die, the land they work does not feed itself, the fields went untended, the harvest collapsed. And with the harvest collapsed, the entire agricultural surplus that had paid for Justinian's empire. The second effect was fiscal collapse. The Roman state ran on taxes, and taxes came from people. With 1/3 to 1/2 of the taxpayers dead, the flow of revenue into the imperial treasury slowed to a trickle, exactly at the moment Justinian needed money most. Here is the cruel timing of it all. Justinian had spent the previous decade fighting 2 ruinously expensive wars of reconquest. His general Belisarius had taken North Africa from the Vandals in 533, and his armies were in the middle of the long, grinding Gothic War to retake Italy, a war that would drag on for nearly 2 decades. These wars had already drained the treasury built up by Justinian's predecessors. The plague, arriving in 542, hit a state already stretched to the breaking point, and it kicked out the revenue that was meant to pay for it all. The third effect was military. The army was recruited largely from the same peasant population that the plague was killing. With so many soldiers dead and so few new recruits able to be raised, Justinian's conquests became increasingly hard to hold. Belisarius and his successors could win battles, but they could not keep filling the ranks. Without the soldiers and without the money, the reconquest became a burden rather than a prize. Italy, the very heart of the old Roman world, was devastated by the war, its population halved, its cities wrecked, its fields ruined. The plains that had once made Italy the richest farmland in Europe took centuries to recover. The Byzantine state was built on a single brilliant monetary foundation, the gold solidus, a coin that stayed pure for over 7 centuries. But a coin is only as powerful as the economy that backs it. With the population collapsed and the harvests failing, there was simply less wealth to mint, less commerce to tax, and less output to fund. Justinian responded the way hard-pressed rulers always do. He tried to squeeze more from those who remained, raising taxes, demanding new levies, pressing the survivors harder. But there is a limit to how much you can extract from a population that has been cut in half. Higher taxes on fewer, poorer people did not refill the treasury. They only added to the burden of the living. The deeper point is that the plague did not just empty the treasury for a season, it permanently changed the demographic shape of the Byzantine Empire. And demography is the slow tide that every economy ultimately rises and falls with. Before the plague, the empire had the population to sustain its armies, its cities, and its tax base. After the plague, it simply had fewer people permanently. The empire never fully recovered the human capital it lost in those terrible years. Every later crisis, the wars with the Persians, the Arab conquests of the 7th century, the centuries of slow contraction, played out against the background of a society that had never rebuilt its population. And the plague did not strike once and then leave. It returned again and again. Historians count at least 18 separate waves of plague across the Mediterranean world between 541 and 767. Every few years, another outbreak would arrive, kill again, and set the recovery back. This is what makes the Plague of Justinian different from a single bad winter. It was a recurring catastrophe that repeatedly kicked an already wounded economy. Each wave killed the young, the workers, the taxpayers, precisely the people an economy needs most. Here is where the story becomes genuinely fascinating, because historians genuinely disagree about just how catastrophic the Plague of Justinian was. On one side, scholars like Harper argue that the plague was a demographic catastrophe that fatally weakened the Roman Empire and made possible its eventual collapse. They point to the mass graves, the eyewitness accounts, and the long-term economic decline. But another school, led by Peter Sarris and more recently by Mordechai and Merle Eisenberg, has pushed back. They argue that the evidence for a civilization-ending catastrophe is thinner than it looks, that the population loss may have been smaller and more regional, and that the empire's troubles were driven as much by war, overextension, and fiscal mismanagement as by plague. The truth is almost certainly in between. The Plague of Justinian was a genuine catastrophe, but it landed on an empire already waging ruinously expensive wars and pushing its fiscal system to the limit. The plague did not act alone. It was the final blow to an overstretched state, the shock that toppled a demographic and financial system that was already wobbling. What the episode teaches us about pandemic economics is chillingly modern. A pandemic does not merely kill people, it destroys the labor force an economy runs on. It collapses the tax base a state depends on. It strikes hardest when a society is already overextended, and its effects are not a single shock but a long, recurring drain. The Byzantine Empire would endure for another 900 years after the Plague of Justinian. It would survive plagues, sieges, and the loss of most of its territory, but it never again possessed the demographic and financial strength of the world Justinian had tried to rebuild in the years before 541. The greatest city of the 6th century was brought low not by an enemy army, but by a microscopic bacterium that slipped in with the grain. It is a reminder that the foundations of every empire, its people, its labor, its tax base, are also its most fragile assets. And it is a warning that the economy of a civilization can be undone, almost overnight, by a force no one can see coming. Thank you for watching Empires and Economics. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and join us next time when we explore the economy of another great civilization.